This model of a German Deutsche Bahn passenger coach is the exact same model based on the prototype as this coach. This is modeling the same prototype as this model. But as you can see, one is significantly shorter than the other. The top coach is known as a Shorty coach, and that's what this video is about today. We're going to talk about Shorty coaches. Why they exist, are they useful, and why are they still worth collecting, buying and operating on your layout. The bottom coach is a correct HO gauge 3.5 millimeters to the foot prototypical scaled down version. This is the real thing in model form with no compromise. However, this one is different because the lateral scale or linear scale is 1/100 approximately. Some manufacturers, the Shorty coaches, are actually less than 1/100. They can be 180 or 190. But generally speaking, Shorty coaches are 1/100 in linear scale. Now, how did this all come about? Well, to understand this, we have to go back to the time when both railroads were beginning, and model trains and the hobby was developing, and the legacy of scales. We begin our story in the United States, well, North America in general, including Canada. We've all grown up on Wild West movies, and this coach here, this passenger car here, as they call it in North America, would be typical of what ran on all American, both and Canadian railroads and around the world in terms of its length up until the First World War. Railway passenger cars and railroad passenger cars tended to be short, whether they worked on long express services, branch lines, or regional or even commuter services. They all tended to be short. The reason for this ranged from some railroads still had tight curves with poor clearance. So you wanted a coach that could leave New York City and travel along a main line and make its way down a branch line and not have any compatibility or engineering problems along the way. The other reason for this was that locomotives didn't have the power that they were to gain later on. They just didn't have the horsepower. And there were other issues as well, including technology regarding braking systems and so on. The first decades of both prototypical railroading and model railroading, model trains, even when they were built in the larger scales, such as the Lionel large scale in America, tended to be more or less the correct linear scale. They were the same length as the prototype. But then things began to change, in the USA in particular, due mainly to the arrival of locomotives with very high horsepower, relatively speaking, compared to what previously existed, new technologies regarding braking systems and so on, straightening out curves and making far longer main lines, that they could then introduce much longer coaches, much longer passenger cars. And so almost overnight they went from this here to this. This is a scale length Pennsylvania Railroad passenger car, generally speaking around 80 to 85 feet long. These were an enormous leap in size from what Americans' railroads were giving in the past. They often ran in much longer rakes and consists of far more coaches. The combination of powerful locomotives, improved signalling, improved right-of-way, improved track, better braking systems, overall comfort, improved technology concerning trucks or bogies, better coupling, and overall better engineering meant that American railroads could produce long trains. Now, this presented a major conundrum for model train manufacturers. Used to creating models that were this size, particularly in the larger scales of the period, they now had to produce them in this size. They were going to have to make a compromise. If you were a manufacturer of model railroads in America and you had to adapt to this change in technology of much larger coaches and passenger cars, it was going to present a couple of different issues. Firstly, expense. A lot more materials are going to be needed for a model such as this in the large Lionel style O-gauge sizes that were very popular there. Secondly, if you were to go and scale them up to the full size, they would be colossal models, very heavy and very large. In fact, if this was to be scaled up to full Lionel or O-gauge scale in America of the period, or even in modern day, it would probably take up a third of the length of my layout. So just think of that. There'll be 1, 2, 3. And often these trains ran in passenger consists of sometimes 15 to 18 cars. And people didn't have generally layouts that enormous. Even Gomez Adams didn't have one that big. So a compromise was made. In the larger scales, they produced these quite short. In fact, sometimes ridiculously short. I've seen Lionel layouts, still made to this day, still manufactured in that scale to these days, of passenger cars that are shorter than the locomotive pulling them. Now, I'm not putting down people who model that stuff. There's a beautiful charm and a sort of sense of scale in that kind of modeling. I can imagine a little American boy or girl having a layout with these huge models on it. It must have felt like having the real thing in your home, the noise and the racket they kick up. But in terms of the hobbyist, in terms of putting them on your standard home HO layout like I've got here, and my HO layout would, HO00 layout I might say, would be pretty typical of what was built as the home HO hobbyist layout in, say, the period of the 1940s, 50s, 60s and 70s. In fact, that's exactly what I've tried to model here. I've tried to model that feel and vibe of those American models of that era. But the manufacturers had to come up with a compromise in HO for two reasons. One was cost, and the secondary one was getting the trains around curves. On model train curves, especially if you sold them model train sets. Now, I'm not ashamed of having tight curves on my layout. It's just these. It's my classic thing. My layout, my rules. But you could have a very bad overhang on a curve. I'll show you here. There's a substantial overhang. You see that? Try to get out of my shadow. There's a substantial overhang. You would never get that in the real thing. And so, in terms of the model train set market, where you would get a locomotive, 3 passenger coaches, say, and a radius, a circle, or an oval of track, they produced the American Shorty version, which is here. And I've actually seen them shorter than this. But generally they would compress the scale of a full-length American passenger car down. This allowed the trains to not look so bad on overhangs, on tight radiuses, allowed less materials to be made, and also to create a product that was cheaper to make, essentially. You didn't use as much materials for this as you did for this. And also, just like the prototype locomotives of the past, the model train locomotives of the day were just not as powerful to pull full-length passenger trains. This also reduced weight. Now, we go somewhat into the world of rivet counting now. You have a situation where even among the craftsman modelers, you had a situation where even among the craftsman modelers, kits were still being supplied in these shorter scales. Again, it was just practicality. There was nothing that could be done about it, really. It was what it was. And most modelers had learned to live with it. And then you had the more rivet counter, pedantic modelers who wanted more realistic looking length coach. It wasn't really a problem. It didn't really bother many people. However, there's always going to be people that will prefer scale length passenger cars. They're always going to want them. That's okay. We now have very powerful modern HO locomotives that can pull them. But there's still a place for these guys. Firstly, I'm not bothered by the look of them, the length of them. I'm not bothered by the fact that they're not scale length. On the second-hand market, you can pick these up usually far cheaper than scale length ones. You can run longer rakes. I can run a scale length rake on my layout of these. These ones will be pushing it, but I can do these ones. Now, there are issues, would I say, not problems, not issues. I would say there are challenges. That's a nice modern terminology. Challenges concerning these kinds of models, and I'll show you, and it comes with the locomotive type. If you model US railroads and you have a standard passenger locomotive from the golden age of railroads, we moved away then, it would be an E unit, such as an E7, E8, E9, and so on. I'm not on the track, I'm not sitting properly. Right? The locomotive is as long as the passenger coach. Clearly, that looks ridiculous. Compare it to the scale length coach. You see the difference? That is the big drawback with the Shorty coach. However, the ubiquitous F unit, the passenger versions such as the FP7s and the FP9s, and you also have situations where you have standard freight ones that have been re-geared pulling passenger coaches, look fine with the scale length, and also with the Shorty. So that's the thing. That's what I do. That's how I get around it. I won't run a really long locomotive with short passenger coaches. And guess what? It looks fine. You can get that big railroading feel, big railway feel, doing just that. Now, I model trains from all over the world. So the exact same issue also arrived outside the US and Europe. If you model 00 gauge British and Irish trains, you have the same issue. You've got the Shorty coaches, and you've got the scale length ones. And you can see the difference. Again, in terms of the Shorty coaches, running them on the intercity HST DMUs class 43, they look fine. With some of the larger locos like a Deltic, if you're working in the shorter scale, the shorter linear scale, again, the loco is the same size as the passenger car. I won't do that. And that's basically the only rule I put into any of this stuff. I have no problem running Shorty coaches. I like collecting Shorty coaches. Some of them can be picked up and be repaired, repainted, the scratches removed, and they are in their own right just as glorious models as the scale length ones. Wonderful. And again, they look great going round corners. So, Shorty coaches, yes, that's the difference. They were compressed to 1/100 scale to get them around tight curvature on model train layouts. My layout has tight curves, so they look fine. There are ways actually to hide the overhang on tight curves. There are ways to hide the overhang on tight curves using a clever mixture of scenic development as well as hiding them in culverts, embankments and so on. Now, as you can see, my layout is filled with all tight curves, and that's gives perfect justification for using Shorty coaches. And at the end of the day, a beautiful model is a beautiful model. GB, if you look at Lionel and similar type modelers using passenger cars, locos, and even freight cars that are not scale length, it does not in any way distract from their enjoyment of the hobby. Just a few quick shots of my layout and some of the changes on it, and we'll be back with doing this soon. Take care. Remember, your layout, your rules.